Welcome again, everyone, and welcome to the Designing Research Capacity Strengthening Components Within Research Proposals seminar. Just to introduce myself, I'm Dr. Justin Pulford, a senior lecturer with the Centre for Capacity Research at the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine. Details about our centre and sort of contacts are on the title slide here. So a lot of the resources I'm talking about today are available on our website, and certainly if you have any follow-up questions, don't hesitate to contact us. Maybe another very brief point, I will be using the acronym RCS throughout this presentation. That stands for Research Capacity Strengthening. So wherever you see that, that's what I'm referring to. So our outline for today, as advertised, our training objectives, how to approach writing the research capacity strengthening section of research proposals, including systematically planning RCS activities at 3 levels. The 3 levels we'll discuss throughout the seminar, designing the activities with partners, indicators for monitoring progress and collecting data against your indicators, and reporting on research capacity strengthening achievements. The session structure, I'll be sort of meeting those objectives over 3 sections. The first focuses on definitions of RCS. We then move to sort of design and implementation questions, and thirdly, evaluation. This will largely be a presentation format following these slides for the first 45 minutes, although I will ask some questions from time to time. Following that, we'll then move to a 30-minute or more clinic, which will be completely unstructured. So if there's any content you want me to cover again, I can go back to that. If you have particular questions you want me to answer in detail, I can. Indeed, if you have some RCS plans that you're currently developing, we can talk through them. So that'll be a completely open forum. I also want to note that references for all the information I'm about to present are listed throughout and indeed at the end of this presentation. So you don't need to scribble notes. Everything is publicly accessible generally through publication. But moving on to definitions of research capacity strengthening then. This is, to be frank, not particularly straightforward. There isn't a sort of known agreed definition of research capacity strengthening that is sort of uniformly used. And this is perhaps best illustrated through a review we completed a few years ago, where across 172 papers, all of which focused on research capacity strengthening, a definition was only presented in 31 of them. And across those 31 papers, there were 25 different definitions, certainly none cited by more than 3. So if you're struggling to find a sort of standard definition, then you're not alone. It just really isn't out there at the moment. But what I'm presenting here is perhaps a favoured definition that we use at the Centre for Capacity Research. Let me just briefly read it out. So the ongoing process of empowering individuals, institutions, organisations and nations to define and prioritise problems systematically, to develop and scientifically evaluate appropriate solutions, and to share and apply the knowledge generated. So the reason we like this is it certainly covers what we describe as the 3 levels of individuals, researchers, research professionals, research institutions, and organisations, and sort of national research capacity or national research systems more broadly. And it also talks about or refers to all stages of the research process, from the capacity to identify problems, to define what they are and prioritize those issues, to conduct research that addresses those research priorities, and then to actually share and apply that knowledge generated. So it kind of encompasses a lot about a strong research system. So we encourage the use of this definition. It's by no means perfect, but it's perhaps one of the better ones out there. Now, I've referred in our training objectives and subsequent to that to the 3 levels of research capacity strengthening. And what we mean by this is captured in this slide. So the first level is the individual researcher or research support worker or research professional. So that's strengthening the capacity of individuals to carry out or support research. And under that figure there, you see some examples of research capacity strengthening initiatives that target the individual. The second level is the research institution, research universities, any institution in which researchers are employed to carry out research work. So again, researchers can't work in isolation. They need a supportive institutional environment to work, productively and as effectively as they can. Again, below that depiction of an institution, you see some examples of what we might consider institutional level research capacity strengthening initiatives. Then the third level, there are different terms to describe this. It can be described as the broader research environment, the broader research system, national research capacity, but essentially it's referring to all elements of the research system that individual researchers and research institutions feed into. So these might be knowledge translation hubs or mechanisms, can be national, international networking mechanisms. I mean, indeed, it's the funding available at national level to support research in the local context, among many other things. That these three categories are not mutually exclusive. So if you're thinking about research capacity strengthening, it's not the case that you would target one or another of these three categories. And indeed, funders are increasingly seeking multi-level research capacity strengthening proposals, so that they want to see research capacity being strengthened across two or three of these levels, rather than just focusing on one. And the one that's most often focused on is the individual. This is not to suggest that you might be expected to increase the capacity in every dimension across all three of these levels, but at least there's some nod to supporting capacity at different levels and in different ways. In terms of how research capacity strengthening components are framed in research proposals, I guess there's, this is a little bit crude, but there are three types of research capacity strengthening sort of objectives within research proposals, if you like. There are research calls where research capacity strengthening is the primary objective. So the main point of the call is to demonstrate that you've strengthened research capacity. A good example of this is the GCRF funding program, and a great example within that is the Growing Research Capacity call. The second type, and probably the most common, is what we would call an embedded research capacity strengthening process. So the embedded research capacity is probably the most common form of RCS within a research call. And here RCS is important, but it's typically secondary to a primary scientific objective. MRC applied global health call would be one example of this, but there are many others. More recently, and the most recent example is the NIHR NCD Research Centre call. We're seeing truly 50-50 splits, where the RCS objective is given equal weight to the scientific objective. But that's less common, but is starting to emerge. Excuse me. Irrespective of these three types, RCS is most often grounded within a development framework. And this suggests, or the underlying premise here, is that greater research capacity will drive population health and socioeconomic development. So certainly ODA funded research would be typically based within this development framework, but RCS can be grounded in other frameworks that are not development based. For example, science is a common good. Now, your approach to RCS design, implementation and evaluation does not need to vary across these three types. So rather, the variance is more likely in terms of scope and ambition. So what you do in terms of your process may be the same, but it may be less ambitious where RCS is embedded as a secondary objective as compared to where RCS is the primary objective. And one thing I often consider, and this is perhaps a little bit the cynic in me, is when preparing a research proposal, where RCS is the need to demonstrate RCS is included, and this is most commonly in an embedded model, maybe something that you can ask yourself as a form of self-check is, am I proposing to do something that I otherwise wouldn't have if the need to demonstrate RCS had not been included in the call? And if the answer to that is no, I would probably do this anyway if the words, if I wasn't required to demonstrate RCS, then maybe you haven't been as ambitious as you could have been. And a good example of this is where you your research might require investing in PhD students or early career postdoc positions and the like. These can quite legitimately be framed as as evidence of research capacity strengthening, because they are. But if you weren't required to demonstrate RCS, would you have done that anyway? If the answer is yes, then maybe your RCS ambitions are not ambitious enough. Well, that's enough about RCS definition. Hopefully that's sort of clear about what we're talking about today. I want to move now to design and implementation considerations. So designing an RCS program that you might want to present in your research proposal, and thinking through some of the implementation considerations of that. What I'm going to present draws on 2 publications, both of which I've listed here. The first is presents guidance and conceptual tools to inform the design, selection, and evaluation of research capacity strengthening initiatives. The second presents a practical and systematic approach to organisational capacity strengthening for research in the health sector. Starting with the first publication, this paper posits that RCS design and or selection should firstly be informed by the overarching goal of your initiative. What is it that you're trying to achieve? Clearly, that will inform the types of things you might do. On a practical sense, you're also constrained by the available the resources you have, human, financial, and physical, and the contextual constraints, simply what is possible in the environment that you are planning to implement your RCS program in. So all of those things always need to be considered. But even when you take those things into consideration, it should almost always be the case that there remain multiple and potentially diverse RCS intervention options open to you to consider using. If you can only think of one thing, you're probably not thinking hard enough. Particularly when you go back to those different levels that we discussed earlier. You may have an intervention focused purely on one, but you might achieve the same objectives by working in it at another level, or indeed across levels. So if you can only think of one RCS possibility, I would contend you're not thinking hard enough. And if you can think of multiple, then you have a choice to make. We may not be able to do all of these things, so what should we do? And a problem we have at the moment is that there's very little empirical evidence to inform that decision making. What RCS intervention works best for what purpose and what context? The short answer is we just don't know. So how do we manage to make these decisions when we don't have the evidence available to inform us? So this paper presents 3 conceptual tools to help with decision making in that context. The first tool is around configuration. So when actually designing your RCS activities, what activity or indeed combination activities should your intervention consist of, and to what degree should they be integrated? Where various RCS intervention options exist, then how complex would each intervention option be to implement relative to another? So if you've got a choice, which one would be more or less easy? And thirdly, anticipated impact. Again, where you've got a choice, what might the anticipated impact of the different alternatives be? The first tool here, struggling to move through my slides now. go. So the first tool, RCS configuration. This is a tool to help you think through how many activities you might want to include in your RCS program and how they might be integrated. So on this slide, there's a graphic that presents 4 potential activities that you might be considering. And these are common types of RCS activities about purchasing or purchasing something or spending money on something, providing training or technical assistance, providing an experience, a learn by doing opportunity, or some advocacy, networking, engagement components. Now, in thinking through your RCS program, which of these activities might you want to focus on and how might you integrate them? This is a tool to think about that. Are you only going to do one thing, in which case there's no integration? But if you're only doing one thing, why? Why not consider something else? If you're going to do more than one thing, then are these activities integrated at all? If they're not integrated, why not? And if you can integrate them, to what extent? There's no easy answer to this. We can't be prescriptive. It's not possible to say that all RCS plans should consist of multiple activities that are substantially integrated, because your program might simply be about investing in infrastructure, for example, so a big grant to build something. However, that's usually not the case. There's usually opportunities to do more than one thing and to do them in quite an integrated way. So thinking through numbers of activities and how you might integrate them is quite important in RCS planning. And the sort of underlying logic is the more activities and the more closely integrated they are, perhaps the more impactful your intervention will be. A second tool speaks to complexity, the difficulty of actually implementing what it is you're proposing to do. And this tool is kind of a 3-dimensional graphic, if you like. The first dimension, cost, is where you can rate the anticipated cost of your intervention from low to high. Is it going to cost a lot or a little or somewhere in between? The second dimension is time. Will you be able to complete your intervention and see some impact from it in a short amount of time, or will it take a long amount of time to implement and see outcomes or impact? The third dimension is control. Do you have a high degree of control over the implementation of your activities and the likely success, or do you have limited or low control over the implementation of your activity? So it may be that you can fund something, but whether it actually gets implemented or not is out of your hands. So the logic of this graphic, if you like, is in thinking through the complexity of your proposed plans. If they plot somewhere like this, the low left-hand corner, the least shaded of those 3 plot points, that suggests your proposed intervention has low cost, is not going to take much time, and is primarily in your control. So this is something that should be relatively straightforward to implement. Conversely, if you plot your proposed intervention on the sort of far high right, the darkest of those plot points, it's going to cost a lot of money, it's going to take a lot of time, and not much of it, the success is not really within your control. So this is a very ambitious and potentially complex intervention to propose. So again, a tool for thinking through what might be a better alternative when you have more than one option available to you. This is not to say that simple interventions should always be favoured over difficult ones. It's just a tool to provide that, to allow you to think through that. But what you also want to consider, which is where our third tool comes in, is anticipated impact. As I said at the start, we don't necessarily have a lot of empirical evidence that allows you to determine that one intervention will be better than another. So if we take that empirical evidence out of the equation, we're still left with, experience. You're still left with your anecdotal evidence, your assumptions of what might work in a context, And indeed, you may have worked those assumptions through within a theory of change or some form of logic model. So if you have more than one intervention available to you, which of those interventions is likely to have the greater impact? And you can think about impact in terms of your program and the immediate outcomes of your program. And you can also think about impact longer term. So an example of this might be a decision to invest in the training and upskilling of scientists in a particular discipline versus investing in a research management and support system. And the context of your proposal, maybe investing in the scientists makes the most sense and would have the biggest immediate impact. But longer term, investing in a research management and support service, it will still have some benefit to your program, maybe not as much as investing in the scientists, but it will have benefit to other programs. And longer term, it means that, you know, if a program like yours was to come along in the future, that stronger management system would be there. That would mean when they invest in scientists, they're going to reap even further reward from that. So the longer term impact might be greater. So when you start to plot all these things together, as we've tried to do on this sort of hypothetical figure here, you can see that you know, the size of the circle indicates anticipated impact. Where you have a big circle that perhaps clusters close to the lower left-hand corner of this graphic, it's probably quite a good bet. So you're going to have quite, you know, a pretty big anticipated impact. It's not going to cost much. It's not going to take too much time, and it's highly under your control. The converse of that is you may have interventions that might have great impact, but if they're going to cost a lot, take a lot of time, and are not in your control, maybe it's just too much to take on. So again, these are three tools that can help you with your decision making as you plan your RCS interventions. Moving on to the second paper now. This is quite different. So that first paper presents tools for your sort of planning and possible implementation. This paper presents a generic and transferable implementation model. So this is a method or process that you can use from start to finish, whatever the objective of your research program may be. We typically refer to it as the 5-step approach, and many of you may have heard of this before. So the 5 steps are depicted here. The first is to ensure that across all of your project partners, you have jointly defined the goal of your research capacity strengthening project. And we often, quite surprisingly, find this doesn't happen as much as you might think it does. So there might be a goal, but it's not well defined. It remains sort of broad and somewhat vague, and different partners are interpreting it in different ways. So really hammering down and defining the specific goal of your project collaboratively is important. Once that goal is identified, the next step is to ask, what might optimum capacity in that area look like? So if what we want to achieve is X, because we know our capacity for X is limited, what does optimal capacity for X look like? So what is the target that we might hope to achieve either during this program or over a longer period of time? That target can be determined in many ways by expert consultation, by some review of the literature, by a combination of different things. But the idea is that a target of optimal capacity is identified. Once that target is identified in step 2, step 3 is then determining the existing capacity against that benchmark, if you like. So we knew there was a problem, but we don't know the extent of it. So step 1 is identifying the problem. Step 2 is identifying the sort of ambitious targets. Step 3 is benchmarking where you actually are against that target. And then based on that, in step 4, you'll develop a bespoke plan to address that gap that you've identified. And in step 5, and basically a quality assurance cycle, you are reviewing progress, learning from your process of trying to resolve that gap. What might you do differently? How might you improve your process to indeed strengthen capacity further, meet your target during the lifetime of your project? So it's a very generic 5-step approach, but this approach or methodology can be applied to any particular research capacity strengthening process. The conceptual tools I presented before this can also be integrated into this. So as you, in step 4, where you want to identify your specific intervention to close the capacity gap, you might use those tools to think through different alternatives, for example. The benefit of this 5-step model is that it's a really clear process that you can refer to in your proposals and provide good citations for, and it has proof that it works. So it's a proven process that you can anchor your work in. I guess the one issue where it can be difficult in terms of a research proposal is the actual specifics of what you're going to do will not be known until sort of steps 3 and 4. So in your proposal, you can only describe the process you're going to follow, not the specific interventions that you might be implementing. So that's a few thoughts on design and implementation. We're going to move to evaluation now. And again, here I'm going to focus on findings from 2 particular publications. The first was a review of existing RCS indicators. So basically asking the question, what's already out there, what might we be able to use? The second paper presents findings from an attempt to perhaps design a research capacity strengthening framework that could apply broadly across many different types of programs. So going to the review first, and there's sort of good news and bad news, I guess, with this paper. The first is that through a systematic search of many publications and reports, we were able to identify a total of 668 RCS indicators that had been reported or described in the published or grey literature. This graph here sort of captures the types of indicators that we found. So off the 668, just over 250 of them were output indicators. Exactly 400 of them were outcome indicators, and I think maybe 3 or 4 of them were impact indicators. So the first message there is that there's very few impact indicators, primarily outcome indicators reported in the literature. The different shading of the bars reflects the levels at which the identified or retrieved indicators reported to. So the darker bar with the number of indicators that spoke to individual research capacity strengthening, the mid-shade bar with the number of indicators that spoke to institutional level capacity strengthening, and the sort of mid-shaded bar, the number of indicators that spoke to systemic national environmental level research capacity strengthening. So what we can see here is that a third of the retrieved indicators spoke to individual RCS, just over a third to institutional, and about a fifth to systemic RCS. So overall not a bad split across those 3 levels, if you like. The problem, so the good news is we found a lot of indicators. The problem is that they really weren't of very good quality. The 668 indicators we were able to collapse to about 9 different categories. So there were indicators that were based around bibliometrics, so number of papers published, quality of papers, things like this. Indicators around collaboration activities, indicators around infrastructure development, indicators around knowledge translation, indicators around recognition, prestige, if you like, indicators around research funding, RMS, research management and support, and finally changes in skills or knowledge. Now, most of the indicators pertain to collaboration activities, research management and support, or changes in skills or knowledge. That's where they largely clustered. But as you can sort of see from this table, very few of them met the sort of quality or sort of SMART criteria that we applied to them. In fact, I think there was only 1% of the total that met those criteria, and even though those indicators were somewhat limited. So there's an example of one indicator here that met all 4 of our criteria, that completed research projects written up and submitted to peer-reviewed journals within 4 weeks of the course end. So the take-home message from this is that there are a number of indicators already out there that you can draw on, but perhaps they're not so great. Here are a small set of examples from the individual level that we found. And I won't read through these, you can look at them briefly. Presents the category that they came from, where different variants within each of those categories, the number of indicators that spoke to each of those variants, and an example of the type of indicator reported. So number of articles, number of conference papers, number of citations, etc. I think what I really wanted to note with this slide is that the full list of retrieved indicators from across all 3 levels, so that full list of 668, are available in the Pulford et al. Publication. So if you're looking for inspiration, that might be one place to find it. But as I noted, sort of the take-home message was there's a lot of indicators out there, but maybe they're not much chop. So the second paper presents findings from an attempt to strengthen that, to actually develop an evaluation framework that has that is tailored towards measuring research capacity strengthening, and has some generic yet strong indicators that could be applied across multiple programs. So a framework and indicators that people can take off the shelf and apply to their program, whatever their program might be attempting to achieve. This project was funded through FCDO and drew largely on the reported log frames from FCDO funded RCS projects. So what has already been reported in these log frames, what can we learn from them? And then based on that kind of review and synthesis, that information was taken to sort of expert workshops and through a key informant process to try and shape them further into something stronger and more transferable. And so what I'll present in the next slide, I guess, is the outcomes of this. But what I need to caution, I suppose, or to tamper expectation, is that this remains a work in development. So it's not yet the case that there is a well-established framework with a strong set of indicators that you can pull off the shelf. There's a development piece, which I'm about to present, but it still needs further work. So again, I know that might be a somewhat disappointing message, that there isn't something off the shelf that you can use, but the previous paper and this one do provide quite a bit of source material that you can work with. In addition to the indicators that came out of paper 2, which I'll present shortly, there were 2 again sort of conceptual tools that I think help you with your own, or potentially can help you with your own sort of planning around how to measure research capacity strengthening. But both of these are really around ensuring that you set your expectations at the right level and indeed communicate those to funders. So that the first figure here, nested TOCs or nested theories of change, I guess attempts to promote a model where at a project level, it should not be an expectation that you develop and apply outcome measures or outcome or impact measures that work at that broader societal level, that can show clearly that your work has resulted in a demonstrable shift in population health, socioeconomic development as a result of having strengthened capacity. Clearly that's not possible. But what your project could show is that you have achieved some outcomes and impacts that work towards that type of wider, longer term impact. And the logic here is that, any M&E model that you present within the context of a specific project should fit into a broader program theory of change, or M&E plan, which in turn should fit into a meta program scheme, which in turn should fit into a broader societal scheme. So we know that facilitating a shift in research capacity strengthening, or a significant shift, is not something any one project can achieve, or any one program can achieve, certainly not within a short period of time, but it is something that many programs working together over a longer period of time can achieve. So if there's buy-in to this sort of contribution, multiple program, longer term framework, then you can perhaps more easily position your project within it. Even if those three outer layers don't exist, you can still sort of conceptualize your program in that way. So set your M&E targets at at the right level. One program can't achieve broad impact, but it can contribute to something that many other programs are doing. The other figure here presents what we call the sort of RCS benefit flow, and it attempts to capture how investing in those three RCS levels goes on to achieve impact. So the logic here is that if you just invest in individuals, then the potential outcomes or impacts that you might have at sort of the broader societal levels are going to be quite minimal. You're going to have bigger impact if you invest in the societal level. That's why that arrow is thicker, if you like. And that's, I think logically we can understand why. If you invest in a system, you might expect greater benefit than if you invest in an individual. But these things are not mutually exclusive. By investing in individuals, you may be strengthening institutions, which in turn may strengthen the broader system. And through these kind of multi-level responses, you start to get that larger scale, broader impact. So again, a conceptual model that may help your thinking about where you direct your investments and why you might justify them. But moving away from concepts to actual indicators and frameworks, so that the development framework that came out of that second paper attempted to apply across all three levels of the individual, the institution, and the society. In the left-hand column here, we see the primary domains that emerged from the synthesis and expert consultation. So these, for each of the levels, are three areas that were considered perhaps most important to measure. So at the individual level, is around the provision and quality of training for your research team. Emphasis there on team, not just researchers, but support workers as well. Recognition of research leadership and esteem, career trajectory. So measures or indicators that measure these things are perhaps particularly valued. At the institutional level, domains around providing or support career pathways for your research team, about having internationally competitive research and grants, and a strong research environment, finance, library, IT labs, etc. The societal level, key domains around research councils and research productivity, your national level. At the international level, around networks and collaborations, and research impact and user engagement. So these were domains that were considered perhaps most useful to measure in an RCS evaluation. And the particular indicators for each of these domains are listed here. Although these are very much prototypes, and that's why I wanted to temper expectation a little, is in this paper, the types of things that you might want to measure are included, and some suggestions around how you might operationalize that, but are there well-defined and tested indicators that you can pull out and use? Not necessarily. But again, useful tools and resources to shape your thinking. And if your work starts to align with what's considered important here, then you can assume that it will have good buy-in from a wider audience, because these domains and indicators have come from that type of broad consultation exercise. So these are some examples at the individual level. Again, on this slide, it's the same thing again, but examples from the institutional level. So if you want to strengthen career pathways for a research team, then ensuring that there are transparent, equitable promotion criteria and processes and career progressions, that there are mentoring schemes available and effective. These not only inform the types of indicators that you might want to use, but indeed the types of programs that you might want to invest in, the types of capacity strengthening activities that you might want to invest in. Same again for competitive research grants, research environments. And thirdly, here we have the same format, but examples of activities and indicators at that societal level. So again, things that you may want to focus activities on, things that you may want to measure. And what I would sort of hope, I guess, that you can take from this review of indicators, both publications, indicators, should speak to the types of activities that you're investing in. And hopefully this starts to broaden your thinking about the different types of things that you might consider including in an RCS plan. And in making that decision making, you can then go back to those conceptual tools, etc., of these possibilities, which ones might be most possible for us to invest in. Okay, that's the end of what I want to formally present. I do have here a list of references, that all of which present pragmatic information for RCS design, implementation, and evaluation. This list includes the papers I've already referred to in this talk, but it also includes additional ones that I haven't referred to. So it's kind of a takeaway slide of useful resources. This should be quite helpful. And that's it, really. That's the thank you slide. So thank you all for listening to that presentation.